want to give a big shout out to our Sapulpa campus, our Coweta campus, those of you that are watching online. So glad to have you on board with us. We're starting a brand new series today that we're calling Say Yes. Say Yes. We'll explain to you in just a little bit what that's all about. But if you've got a Bible or if you've got some kind of device, you can open up a Bible. I want you to open it, turn it on, power it up, turn the pages to Luke chapter 7. Luke chapter 7 will be at verse 1 in just a little bit. We're going to look at multiple places throughout that chapter in just a minute. A few years ago, a lady named Shonda Rhimes wrote a book on how she committed to saying yes to everything for an entire year. If that name sounds familiar to you, it might be because she's been involved with some television series like Grey's Anatomy, Scandal, How to Get Away with Murder, so you might know her from that. So the adventure that she captures in her book called A Year of Yes was somewhat prompted by a conversation that she had with her sister one time, and her sister told her this. She said, "You never say yes to anything. You never say yes to anything." And that was just from observing her life and watching, from a close distance there. And maybe you can relate to Rhimes' previous life. She said something like this: "I never go anywhere. I never do anything. All I did was work and come home. My life had gotten really small." And so she decided that she was going to quit saying no and she was going to start saying yes. Now, I don't know that I would agree with everything that she went about saying yes to, but it is easy to find yourself where there's no passion, there's no risk, there's no purpose, there's no adventure. You can very easily get comfortable in the land of no. But we were created for so much more than that, so much more than that, for more than small thinking, for more than small living. And so we're going to talk about saying yes. Now, our culture, on the other hand, has gotten comfortable with saying no. In fact, our culture that has become more hurried, has become more marginless, has become comfortable with saying no, and in fact encourage saying no. Now, let me just say, that's not all bad. I think there are things that we need to say no to. We cannot say yes to everything. We cannot say yes to everything that somebody else wants us to do. We can't even say yes to everything that we want to do. But I think sometimes saying no has become an excuse, or this idea here that we can say no even to the important things, and important things like having an attitude of service, which is what we're talking about. In fact, if you will Google something like how to say no or best ways to say no, you're going to find an entire world of of articles, of websites that articulate how you can say no without saying the word no, how you can say no while still being polite. And so we have, as a culture, perfected this idea of just saying no. Did Jesus have to say no to things? Well, sure he did. There were times we could go through and we could list them where Jesus refused to do certain things. Jesus said no intentionally to some things. But I think if you were to look overall, if you were to take a pretty high view of his life, you would see that Jesus had a bias for yes. In fact, I made the statement last week when Jesus was with the two men. This is post-resurrection. Two men that were traveling to Emmaus, and they finally arrive at this village, and they invite Jesus to stay, and Jesus does. And we use the terminology this way: when you invite Jesus in, he will always say yes. Those are the kinds of things where Jesus has a bias for yes. He will always say yes. And what we're going to find in Luke chapter 7 is that Jesus says yes a lot. Jesus is going to repeatedly say yes. Let's jump into God's Word, Luke chapter 7, verse 1. When Jesus had finished saying all of this to the people who were listening, he entered Capernaum. Now, I want to stop there for just a minute because I think this is important. Jesus had just finished preaching in the previous chapters of Luke the greatest sermon, the greatest message that we have recorded, the Sermon on the Mount. You can go back and you can read. It's some of the same wording as we find in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. What's interesting is, what does he do next? Well, Luke chapter 7, verse 1 tells us. Now, he could have booked another speaking engagement. You know, he did so good at that one. Let's see if we can improve and go do something even bigger and better. He could have holed up and written a book, but he doesn't. What he does is he goes back towards home and he lives his teaching out. And what we see are these three stories, three encounters that Jesus has with people in Luke chapter 7. First story, Jesus hears about a Roman centurion who needs his help. Next couple of verses. There, a centurion servant whom his master valued highly was sick and about to die. The centurion heard of Jesus and sent some elders of the Jews to him, asking him to come and heal his servant. Now, we've got a centurion who is obviously a Roman soldier. The word implies, and is true, that he would have been in charge of 100 soldiers. This was the occupying force in, this Jewish homeland. And so the soldiers were typically not respected. They kind of despised this occupying force, at least the Jews did. And so you've got this man who typically is not going to be seen in, too high of regard. But later on in the story, we find out that he's been very sympathetic to the Jewish people. And in fact, it helped to build a synagogue. And so he's got this servant. We're told that this servant is one that he values highly. In fact, later on in verse 7, it emphasizes even more so that this is a young servant or a child over the servant part of it. So more than a servant, this is like a son to the centurion. And so the centurion sends a delegation of people asking for Jesus to help with his sick servant. What does Jesus do? He says yes. He says yes to the man, and he heals the centurion's servant with just a word. He doesn't even make it all the way to the house. He just heals him at a distance. Second story shows Jesus meeting up with a funeral procession. It's likely the next day after this event right here. And verse 11 says, soon afterwards, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out. Then we're told a little bit more about that dead person. It was the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. So we've got a large crowd coming into town, and we've got a large crowd going out of town. And what's going to happen is we're going to have, kind of a traffic jam here. I'm sure Jesus has some things to do. I'm sure he's got a schedule to follow. Yet we see that he gets concerned about this body that's being carried out. And when he realizes that this is a widow bearing her only son, then we're told that he cares deeply about this. So here's the situation. This woman has lost both her husband and her son. This son, this funeral this day, it would have been an emotional loss for her, but maybe even more significant because of the day and age. It would have been a place where there was no one to care for her now. There was no means of support. And the entire village must have felt for this poor woman. So there's this large crowd following this funeral procession out of the city. And there's this large crowd that's pushing itself into the city with Jesus along with it, creating this awkward traffic jam. And Jesus sees what's going on. Verse 13 says, his heart went out to her. And what does Jesus do? He says yes. He says yes, and he raises this young man from the dead. I hope you'll read through the rest of the story or glance down even as you're looking at it right now. He raises this young man from the dead, and he restores this family, and he provides hope for this woman and a means of support again in her life. There's a third story that happens, a third encounter, as you get more towards the end of the chapter 36. And it's an event that happens at a dinner party. When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. And later we're going to find out that this Pharisee's name was Simon. And you can be pretty certain that this was not a friendly invitation. In fact, we see repeatedly what the Pharisees were trying to do was to argue theology with Jesus, hoping to entrap him, hoping to embarrass him. But it says Jesus went knowing that, and he reclines at the table. Remember, the tables in those days, at least in Jewish custom, were just inches off the ground. They laid on their left side on a pillow, their head at the table, their feet pointing away from that. And there Jesus is. Verse 37 says, a woman in that town who lived a sinful life. I mean, it literally says a woman who was a sinner learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, so she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. So while Jesus was at the table, in walks this nameless woman, and she's a woman with a reputation. We're not told what it is, but from some hints that we see through the rest of it, it has been understood for lots of years that this was probably the neighborhood prostitute. And she comes into this house, which is a pretty good question to go, wait a minute, what's she doing in the house? A Pharisee wouldn't have invited her in. What's she doing there? Well, often when they would have some kind of dinner party like this, it would be normal for people to be invited to come and to observe. Maybe they're looking through the windows, the doorway. Maybe they're just crowded around. Maybe this was somewhere, where there was some access. And so there were people that are there. They would be allowed to observe, maybe to even interact with the guests at the party. And at the end of the party, they would be the ones that would receive the leftovers. And so it was somewhat of a benevolent scenario here. Verse 38, as she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, she kissed them, and she poured perfume on them. Okay, are you catching all this? So Jesus is reclining at the table. She's at his feet crying. What's she crying about? Again, we're not told. Maybe it has to do with her sin. Maybe it's her repentance over her sin. But not only is she crying, she's crying so much that her tears begin to fall on Jesus' feet. Maybe that embarrasses her. So she begins to wipe them, which means she pulls her hair down and she begins to wipe his feet and dry off the tears. She not only does that, she kisses his feet, and then she has this perfume that's around her neck. Likely this is, her only possession. This is maybe like her retirement. This is a costly perfume. And she begins to anoint Jesus' feet with this perfume. Now, that's pretty awkward here for Jesus. I mean, you've got a woman who's crying. You've got a woman who is letting her hair down in public, which would have been shameful in Jewish custom. You've got a woman who is wiping this embarrassingly costly and likely very fragrant perfume on his feet. And in fact, we're told later in the story, people are wondering, doesn't Jesus know what kind of reputation this woman has? What if people think she has a prior acquaintance, that she's a prior acquaintance of Jesus? You know the feeling that you have when you maybe you're downtown and you walk by a homeless person. Or maybe you're driving and you get off one of the exits or you're at one of the intersections and the homeless person is right there and you're first in line and you're right next to them and you can feel them looking at you right there. You know how that feeling, goes for you and maybe you're glad to drive off or to keep on walking by. I don't know what you do when you have that happen to you. But in this case, that's not a possibility. I mean, this woman just stays there. Jesus doesn't go. He's not leaving. It's not just a passing by. This woman stays for what would have seemed like an eternity. And what does Jesus do? Once again, he says yes. He says yes to her presence and yes to her maybe undesired, at least on the parts of other people there, her undesired attention. He says yes even to forgiving her of her sin. So these three encounters, what do they have in common? Why does Luke loop them together? At least a couple of them would have happened chronologically together, but why does he seem to collect them together? What do we learn from that? Well, in the first story, we've got this soldier servant boy. I mean, I guess if we were to look at it in just a very worldly way, this was a nobody of an enemy. I mean, that's how this servant would have typically been seen. You had a Roman centurion who has this young boy servant, and I mean, this is just, a nobody. But Jesus says yes. Jesus said yes to insignificant and unexceptional. He said yes to insignificant and unexceptional. It's so contrary to us sometimes because we often don't want to mess with the small things or the small favors for the small people. If it gets us down the road or if there's some kind of payback, kickback for us, then we're interested. But you know what? So much of serving is in the shadows. It's out of the limelight. It's behind the scenes. It's the small stuff, the quietly done without anyone noticing. It's no notoriety, no reward, no recognition. I mean, that's what Jesus modeled for us right here by healing this servant boy. There would have been no one that was extremely happy except that centurion's family. There would have been no fanfare about this. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul says, here's some of the parts of the church, or some of the parts that God has appointed for the church. Parts of the body is the context of what he's talking about. And he mentions apostles, and he mentions teachers, and he mentions prophets, and he mentions leaders. And then he uses this terminology. He says, and those who can help others. That's it. I mean, there's no exciting, leadership in charge thing, prophet, know-it-all. There's none of that right there. No fanfare right there. But isn't that true? So much of serving, so much of volunteering is just helping. It's just doing the nameless, faceless, thankless task. I mean, for those of you that are gathered in a service right now, you maybe know or at least recognize the people that were up front and on the stage that sang, or the person that, spoke, or who's doing the teaching today. You know those things, but you likely don't know everyone else. The one that unlocked the door this morning before anybody else was here, the person that came early and made the coffee, the person that brought the donuts in, the person that helped clean up something from last night, the person, we don't know the ones that just helped, the ones who help others. That's such a significant thing, and that's a lot of what service is. It's just those who can help others. In the second story, Jesus is interrupted from his schedule with something urgent. This widow, she's lost her only son, and here's this crowd with Jesus trying to go one way, and this procession is in their way and interrupting them. And I guess we could say it this way. Jesus said yes to interruption and inconvenience. He said yes to interruption and inconvenience. I mean, we don't typically like to be interrupted or delayed. It messes up our plans. Every one of us could tell some crazy story about missing a flight or something because of a delay. When our plans get upset, our hearts often shut down. In fact, my reaction to a delay or a change of plan is, I can't believe this. Why is this happening to me? And quite honestly, often my heart turns cold. I'm not interested in anybody else's needs but the current situation for me. What though if we saw interruption and inconvenience not as an intrusion into life, but as a part of life, as a part of ministry, the cost of following Jesus maybe? What if we said serving Jesus and serving others was more important to us than our managed schedules and our stress-free living? What if we lived life at a pace that allowed for interruption and inconvenience? What if we planned for it instead of ran from it? What if we embraced that was a part of following Jesus, that we would encounter those kinds of scenarios where we could stop whatever the priority in our life was at that particular time, and we could concentrate on loving and serving somebody else? The third story, that one may be the most difficult for us. I mean, when you read through it, you're like, okay, I understand the first two. A servant boy got healed. A young man was raised from the dead. But what did Jesus actually say yes to here? Nobody requested a healing. The woman doesn't apparently even request that Jesus forgive her sin. What did Jesus actually say yes to? He could have brushed her off. He could have excused her, excused himself. But instead, he allowed the undesired attention, and then ultimately told her that he forgave her of her sins. And so let me just word it this way. Jesus said yes to awkward and uncomfortable. Jesus said yes to awkward and uncomfortable. I mean, really, that is the center of service right there. This sinkhole of human need. I mean, this woman would have represented that. I mean, in that day, that was just the epitome of human need right there. And we look at that, and that's often why we don't get involved. Because it's easier to not think about it. It's easier to be far away from it. It's easier to coast in our places of comfort instead of intentionally putting ourselves in places that might cause us to have a floundering conversation or to do something I'm not completely confident in my ability. And so we avoid doing anything that might be too risky or might be a source of embarrassment for us. Which, by the way, this is really kind of the definition of trust, isn't it? I trust God to do something in me and through me that I can't do for myself, that I'm not completely confident in doing for myself. See, the truth is, we want to do things in life that are noteworthy and rewarding, things that fit our schedule and fit our skill sets, that provide us some enjoyment and provide us some pleasure. And Jesus calls us to something that's more challenging than that. I think he often calls us to some of those things, but he calls us to something more adventurous than that, something that requires more trust than that. To say yes to insignificant and unexceptional. To say yes to interruption and inconvenience. To say yes to awkward and uncomfortable. Even though through Luke 7, I have this deep respect for the amazing miracles that Jesus performed there. I mean, raising someone from the dead, that's probably the epitome of a true miracle right there. But maybe even more respect, at least from my end, is directed here for the bias for yes, the bias to say yes that Jesus demonstrated. That's certainly motivated by his love. Even greater, I think, than the miracles that he performed is his propensity to say yes to people in their time of need. I mean, think about it. Here, Jesus is on mission. He has limited time to accomplish that mission. I'm sure he's aware of that. He knows the urgency that's taking place. Yet his love and his service and his bias for yes was a higher goal than his ministry output or his kingdom efficiency. Did you hear that? Jesus serving others, his desire and his bias to say yes to the needs of other purpose were a higher goal than his ministry output or his kingdom efficiency. So here's kind of what we want to see and what we want to have happen during our Say Yes series. We want to raise high the banner for serving in our church. We want to raise it up. We want to look at that and go, this is it. This is what we're called to do. We want to create a more intense culture of volunteerism. We want an army of people who gladly, not reluctantly, but gladly say yes. We want to celebrate those who are selflessly serving and say that's where true joy, that's where true satisfaction comes from. It's not from meeting our own needs. It's not from pursuing our own happiness. True joy and satisfaction, it comes from serving Jesus and comes from serving others. So when you serve, you're saying yes to Jesus. You're saying yes to Jesus. Remember in Matthew 25, Jesus, this is right before he dies. And he's telling people, teaching people about what's going to happen during the end days. And he's talking about this separation that's going to take place. And Jesus is going to tell some people, listen, when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. And when I was naked, you clothed me. And when I didn't have a place to stay, you let me stay in your place. And the people are like, Jesus, what are you talking about? We never saw that. We never saw. And Jesus said, when you did it to the least of these, you did it for me. What Jesus is saying, listen, if you're serving, you're doing it for me. When you're serving, you're saying yes to Jesus. You're saying that you're following Jesus, and Jesus recognizes that. When you serve, you're saying yes to Jesus. When you serve, you're saying yes to the next generation. You're saying yes to the people that are going to follow behind us. And that's always going to be the case. There will always be some people who, out of a love for others and a selfless serving attitude, are going to say, I'm going to give up the things that I want. I'm going to sacrifice the time for the people that are going to come behind me, for the younger generation. And some of the things that we'll talk about over the next few weeks, and you'll see that, service has a lot to do with the next generation. They are worth our sacrifice, and so we surrender our time and our money and our preferences for our children, for our students. It's one of our values as a church. We will give up things for the generation that follows. We will serve. When you serve, you're saying yes to the next generation. When you serve, you're saying yes to the people that aren't even here yet. To people that don't even know Jesus yet, don't even know that they need to know Jesus yet. We keep talking about it. Our mission is about helping others follow Jesus. And so the things that we do, the things that we endeavor, the things that we work on, we serve to create that kind of environment that will be one that is inviting for people who don't know Jesus yet. Tony Campolo tells the story of a drunk named Joe who had one of those miraculous conversions at a downtown mission. Prior to his conversion, Joe had been that dirty wino that nobody had any hope for. He was probably going to live a miserable existence in the ghetto somewhere. But following his conversion, Joe experienced new life and everything changed for him. He became the most caring person that anyone associated with the mission. He spent his days and nights hanging out at the mission, doing whatever needed to be done. There wasn't anything that was beneath him. He would do whatever it takes. Sometimes it meant cleaning up the vomit from an alcoholic who'd gotten violently sick. Sometimes it was scrubbing the toilets after careless men left them filthy. I mean, this guy, he served with a smile, and he served like he was gracious for the chance to help. He could be counted on to feed men who wandered into the mission, and sometimes he even tucked them into bed when they weren't together enough to care for themselves. One evening, the director of the mission was delivering the usual evangelistic message to just a bunch of people who were half asleep and had drooped heads, but there was one person that looked up, and he came down the aisle to the altar, and he knelt to pray, and he began crying to God to help him to change. So this repentant drunk kept shouting these words, "Oh God, make me like Joe. God, please make me like Joe. God, make me like Joe. Make me like Joe. Make me like Joe." And the director of the mission leaned over to this guy, and he said to him, Son, don't you mean make me like Jesus?" And the man looked up at the director, had a little bit of a confused expression on his face, and he asked this very sincerely, "Is he anything like Joe?" Let me tell you this truth. You are never more like Jesus than when you say yes to serving. Never more like Jesus. People will never recognize Jesus more in your life than when you are serving. It's humbling. Serving can mess up your plans. It can be inconvenient. It can be awkward. It can be uncomfortable. But it is the most rewarding thing that you can do in this life. And it will point people to Jesus more than anything else in your life. If you're a believer, you were created to serve. If you're a believer, you were saved to serve. If you're a believer, you were called to serve. You were gifted to serve. And if you're a believer, you're needed to serve. Will you say yes with us? Pray with me. Father, we thank you so much for the time to share in your word and to be reminded of the example of Jesus, of just saying yes. Father, thank you for showing us that bias for yes that was a part of his life, that just wanted to help and just wanted to love and just wanted to serve people. We thank you for the miracles that are represented that we talked about today. We're thankful, Father, the reminder of the forgiveness of sins, even for the deepest of sinners. But Father, most of all, we're reminded of the example that Jesus gives of saying yes. So, Father, would you help us to do that, to say yes? We pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.